When I was 15 years old, I was constantly looking for ways to make some extra pocket money. At that age, you are in this weird middle ground where you want to buy things, but you are not old enough to get a regular on-the-books job at a grocery store or a restaurant. So like a lot of teenagers in my position, I turned to babysitting. Most of the time, it was pretty safe and routine. I would watch kids for family friends, neighbors, or people my parents had known for years. It was usually just a few hours of sitting on a couch, watching cartoons, eating snacks, and putting a kid to bed. But one afternoon during summer break, I was sitting on my computer in my bedroom, scrolling through Craigslist to see if anyone in our local community was hiring for quick odd jobs. That was when I saw an ad that immediately caught my eye. A woman was looking for an overnight babysitter for her 6-year-old daughter named Rose. The ad explained that the mother worked late-night shifts at a local hospital and just needed someone to stay at the house while her daughter slept. The best part of the job, according to the post, was that Rose would already be asleep before the babysitter even arrived, and she would remain asleep through the entire night. The pay they were offering was $25 an hour, which was an absolute fortune for a 15-year-old back then. It sounded like the easiest money I would ever make in my life. I immediately sent the woman an email expressing my interest and went about my day. About an hour later, I got a reply in my inbox. She asked for my phone number so we could chat. That evening she called me. She sounded completely normal, calm, and very polite. She answered all of my questions without hesitating. She told me that she had to leave for her shift before I could get there, so she would hide a key outside for me. She explained exactly where the key would be hidden, under a specific decorative flower pot near the front steps. Since I was only 15, my mom wanted to talk to her before giving me permission to go to a stranger's house. The woman spent several minutes on the phone with my mom, answering her questions and reassuring her. She promised my mom that the house was in a safe area, and that it would be a very quiet night since Rose was a heavy sleeper. She said she was a single mother just trying to make ends meet working the night shift. Whatever they talked about, it made my mom feel comfortable with the whole arrangement. She hung up and told me it sounded like a great opportunity to make some good money. The babysitting job was scheduled for the very next night, starting at around 9:30. When the time came, my mom drove me over to the address. The house was located in a very quiet residential neighborhood about 20 minutes away from our place. It sat near the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by tall, thick trees that blocked out a lot of the streetlights. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something a little odd right away. Every single light inside the house was turned on. It was absolutely glowing in the dark neighborhood, which felt strange for a house where a 6-year-old was supposedly already fast asleep. My mom waited in the car with the engine running while I walked up to the front porch to find the hidden key. It was exactly where the woman had told me it would be, tucked under the flower pot. I unlocked the heavy front door, which made a loud creaking sound, and stepped inside. I set my backpack down in the entryway, turned around, and waved goodbye to my mom. She backed out of the driveway, her headlights sweeping across the dark trees, and just like that, I was completely alone in the house. The house was dead quiet, except for the loud, rhythmic ticking of a wall clock in the kitchen. I assumed Rose was upstairs sleeping in her bedroom, just like her mother had said. At first glance, the place looked totally normal. There were family photos hanging on the walls, a few toys scattered near the living room couch, and a pink backpack leaning against a wooden chair. On the refrigerator, there were children's drawings held up by colorful magnets. It looked like a typical family home. Still, being in a new place, I wanted to get a feel for the layout of the house. I decided to walk through the first floor. The kitchen, which had a cold linoleum floor, connected to a long, narrow hallway that led towards several bedrooms. As I stepped into that hallway, I glanced through an open doorway on my right. I was not expecting to see what was waiting for me inside. There was a grown man standing in the middle of the room. He was facing the window, just staring straight out of it. But what made this extremely unsettling was that it was pitch black outside. There was absolutely nothing to see out there except darkness. I froze and stared at him for several seconds, my heart beginning to race. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt and dark jeans, and he was completely still. Finally, I mustered up the courage to say something. I asked if anyone was there. The second I made a sound, he spun around to face me. The first thing I noticed was a wide, vacant smile. The second thing I noticed was that one of his front teeth was completely missing, leaving a dark gap in his mouth. I asked him who he was, but his smile did not change, and he did not say a single word. He just stood there staring right through me with empty eyes. I slowly backed out of the doorway, pulled out my phone, and called the woman who had hired me. She answered after a few rings. I tried to stay calm, but my voice was shaking as I explained that there was a strange man standing in one of the bedrooms. She seemed confused for a split second, stuttering over her words, and then she suddenly acted like she remembered something. That sudden, unnatural shift in her voice is something that still sticks with me to this day. She laughed it off and explained that the man was her brother. She said he had dementia and sometimes wandered around the house at night, but she had forgotten to mention him. She told me not to worry because he was completely harmless. That explanation did not make me feel any better. If her brother was living in the house, that was definitely something that should have been mentioned in the Craigslist ad, or during our phone call. Before she hung up, she told me to help myself to anything in the fridge, and said I could sleep in the guest room at the very end of the hallway. After the call ended, I stood there in the quiet hallway, trying to process what was happening. Eventually, I decided I needed to check out the rest of the layout. The door to the room where the man had been standing was still open, but he was no longer visible from the hallway. That made me incredibly nervous. I slowly walked further down the hall. There were 4 doors besides the guest room. I tried the handle of the first door. It was locked. I tried the second door. Locked. I tried the third door. Also locked. I grabbed each brass knob, twisted it, and heard the solid metallic click of a locked latch. When I reached the 4th door, it opened about 3 inches before hitting something on the other side and stopping. I peered through the narrow crack. The room looked completely empty, but the lights were off, so I couldn't see much. I pushed the door slightly harder, and it swung open a bit more. It was just an empty, unused room with no furniture at all. Feeling silly for being so scared, I walked back toward the kitchen. As I passed the refrigerator again, I stopped and looked closer at the drawings. Something felt wrong. The paper on the drawings had yellowed significantly around the edges, looking like they had been there for a decade. One of the drawings was of a family of 3 under a blue sun, with the name Rose written in faded green crayon. There was a thick layer of gray dust sitting right on top of the magnet holding it in place. I looked over at the pink backpack I had seen earlier. It looked faded and worn, like it had been sitting in the sun for years. I started wondering when the last time a child had actually lived in this house was. A heavy feeling settled in my stomach. I realized that despite being in the house for nearly half an hour, I had not heard a single sound from Rose. I had not seen her room. I had not seen any toys that looked like they were currently being played with. There were no children's shoes by the door, no school papers, nothing. I walked back down the hallway to the guest room at the end. It was a very small room, with a single bed and a small nightstand. I put my backpack on the floor and turned around to look back out. That was when I saw him again. The man was standing at the opposite end of the hallway, staring right at me. His wide, toothless smile was back on his face. I had not heard a single footstep. It was like he had just materialized out of thin air. I had no idea how long he had been standing there, watching me. We stood there, staring at each other. I was looking at him like he was some kind of confused animal, not even a real person. I quickly stepped inside the guest room and shut the door. There was no lock on the door. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, trying to calm myself down. I actually knew a lot about dementia because my great-grandmother had passed away from it. I tried to use that to justify his behavior, telling myself he was just confused and didn't know what he was doing. But deep down, my gut was screaming that something was terribly wrong. I picked up my phone and called my mom. It took 3 attempts before she finally answered. I quickly explained the entire situation, telling her about the unannounced brother with dementia, the locked doors, and the fact that I had not seen or heard any sign of the child. My mom went completely silent for a few seconds. Then, her voice changed. She told me she was coming to get me immediately. Hearing her say that made me feel a wave of relief, but also a new wave of fear. If my mom was this worried, then my instinct was correct. She hung up, saying she would be there as fast as she could. A few minutes passed. Then I heard the sound of footsteps. They were coming down the hallway, slowly stepping toward my room. I sat frozen on the bed, holding my breath. The footsteps got closer and closer until they stopped directly outside my door. Everything went silent. I stared at the doorknob, waiting for it to turn. I checked my phone to see if the woman had called back to check on me, but there was nothing. I tried calling her 3 more times, but she did not answer. While I was waiting, the bedroom door slowly creaked open a few inches. The gap was too narrow for me to see who was standing out there. I just sat there, paralyzed, staring at the cracked door. Whoever was out there did not try to come in. They just stood there in the dark. I knew it had to be the brother. In those final tense seconds, I decided I was not going to wait around to see what happened next. I got off the bed, quietly slid over to the window, and forced the stubborn latch open. I scrambled out, dropping into the dark backyard. I did not look back. I ran as fast as I could until I reached the street, crossed to the other side, and kept running. I was nearly a block away before I finally slowed down to catch my breath. I pulled out my phone to call my mom, but before I could dial, a text message popped up on my screen. It was from the woman's number. The message simply said, "Where are you going?" I froze and looked back toward the house. I couldn't see anyone in the yard or at the windows. I had not seen any cameras when I walked into the house. Yet, somehow, she knew the exact moment I had left. That was the moment I became absolutely convinced that something dangerous was happening. I called my mom and told her not to drive to the house. I told her to pick me up further down the street. About 10 minutes later, her car pulled up. I jumped into the passenger seat, locked the doors, and we sped away. Neither of us ever tried to contact that woman again. I never found out who that man really was, if Rose actually existed, or why all those doors were locked. Maybe I was just paranoid, but the chances of that being a normal situation are slim to none. Something deeply disturbing was going on in that house. Fast forward a year or two. When I was 15 or 16, I managed to get a summer job cleaning vacant units in a low-income housing condo complex. I got the job through a property manager named Mrs. Gable, whom I used to babysit for. For a high school student, the pay was surprisingly good, and the work was straightforward. Whenever a tenant moved out, my job was to go into the empty unit and clean it up so it would be ready for the next family. A lot of these units had been abandoned in a massive hurry. People would just pack up what they could carry and leave the rest behind. Some of the places looked like the tenants had literally just gotten up in the middle of the day and walked out, leaving their entire lives behind. One day, I was assigned to work alongside a university student named Jen. She was about 20 or 21 years old, so she naturally took the lead on the job while I followed her instructions. She was very practical, always wearing a college sweatshirt with her hair in a messy bun, and she usually had headphones in. On this particular day, we were assigned to clean a unit located at the very end of a row of townhouses. The layout of this unit is really important to understand what happened later. When you entered through the front door, you walked directly into the living room. On the right side of the room, there were 2 sets of stairs. One set of stairs led up to the bedrooms on the 2nd floor. The other set of stairs was behind a closed door and led down into the basement. The basement stairs turned twice, which meant that when you were standing on the main floor, you could not see down into the basement at all. The basement itself was just one large, unfinished concrete room. It had a washer, a dryer, a furnace, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. There were no closets, no side rooms, no alcoves, and absolutely nowhere for a person to hide. When Jen and I first walked into the unit, it was immediately clear that the previous tenants had left in an extreme rush. The kitchen was absolutely filthy, and most of their personal belongings were still scattered everywhere. We spent the first part of the afternoon packing everything into heavy-duty garbage bags and sorting out items that could be donated. Once we had all the trash and belongings cleared out, we started the actual cleaning process. Part of the kitchen cleanup involved pulling the heavy oven and the refrigerator away from the walls, so we could clean the grease and dirt behind them. We also had to remove the metal drawer from underneath the oven to clean out the food crumbs. However, when we tried to put the drawer back in, we realized the metal rails were warped and damaged. The drawer just would not slide back into its slot properly. For reasons that seemed logical to us at the time, Jen and I decided to stand on opposite sides of the drawer and kick it. We kicked it repeatedly until it finally wedged itself tightly back underneath the oven. The metal ground together with a loud screech. When we tried pulling it out again to see if it worked, it wouldn't budge at all. It was completely stuck. We both immediately regretted doing that because we knew we had jammed it. But we figured we would just let the property manager deal with it later. After that, we decided to split up to get the work done faster. Jen went upstairs to clean the bedrooms, while I stayed on the main floor to remove the glass light fixtures from the ceilings so I could wash them in the kitchen sink. I was standing on a small ladder in the middle of the living room when I heard Jen call my name from upstairs. I called back to her, asking what she needed, but there was no response. I climbed down the ladder and walked up the stairs to check on her. When I found her, she was sweeping one of the bedrooms with her headphones on, listening to music. I asked her what she wanted, but she just looked at me with a confused expression. She asked me what I meant, and I told her she had just called my name. She laughed, shook her head, and told me she hadn't said a word. I figured I was just hearing things, shrugged it off, and went back downstairs to finish my work. Now, there was one thing about that staircase that had always bothered me. Directly above the stairs, there was an attic access panel in the ceiling. The cover for the panel was missing, leaving a square, dark opening leading up into the crawl space. Every single time I walked up or down those stairs, I found myself staring up into that square of complete pitch-black darkness. It always gave me an uneasy feeling. A few minutes after I went back downstairs, I heard my name being called again. This time, before I could even call back, Jen yelled down from the top of the stairs. She told me she had not called my name and joked that I was starting to hear things. At the time, I laughed and agreed with her. It was a bit weird, but I wasn't truly frightened yet. A little while later, I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing the glass light fixtures. I turned around to grab a fresh sponge from the counter, and I nearly tripped over something on the floor. I looked down, and to my absolute surprise, the oven drawer was sitting halfway out on the floor. I stood there staring at it. Jen and I had kicked that drawer with all our strength to wedge it into place, and we had confirmed that it was completely stuck. Yet, here it was, slid open. I kicked it back in, which took several hard blows before it jammed under the oven again. I grabbed the handle and pulled as hard as I could to make sure it was stuck. It didn't move. Satisfied, I went back to the sink. A few minutes later, I turned around again, and my foot caught on something. I almost fell. The drawer was back out. I had not heard a single sound. Nobody else was downstairs with me. This time, I felt genuinely unsettled. The drawer had not just slid out on its own. It had been jammed tight. I decided to just leave it there and let the property manager handle it. I went upstairs to check on Jen, who was still busy cleaning. I went back to my work, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I started reinstalling the clean glass light fixtures. Since it was a bright sunny summer afternoon, I had turned off the main light switches while I worked on the wiring. I was standing on the ladder, trying to screw one of the fixtures back into the ceiling when the light suddenly switched on. The sudden, bright glare startled me so badly that I lost my balance and fell backward off the ladder. The glass fixture slipped from my hands and came crashing down onto the hardwood floor, shattering into a million pieces. It narrowly missed hitting me in the head. I sat on the floor for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath. From where I had fallen, I had a direct line of sight to the light switch. There was absolutely nobody standing near it. At the same exact time, I could hear Jen's footsteps moving around directly above me on the second floor. There was absolutely no way she could have run downstairs, flipped the toggle switch, and run back upstairs in the split second it took for me to fall. The physical switch had moved to the on position by itself. I still wasn't thinking about ghosts or anything supernatural, but I was definitely done working alone. I went upstairs to find Jen and told her what had happened. She looked genuinely uneasy. Then she told me something that made my stomach drop. A few minutes earlier, she thought she had heard someone call her name too, and she knew it wasn't me. We were both officially creeped out and wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. The only task we had left was to sweep the basement. Neither of us wanted to go down there alone, so we decided to go together. As I mentioned before, the basement was just a single, open concrete room with nowhere for anyone to hide. While Jen swept the floor, I sat on top of the dryer and talked to her to keep us both distracted. Within a few minutes, she was done, and we eagerly headed back upstairs. We were so relieved to be finished with the unit. We started gathering our cleaning supplies in the living room, getting ready to lock up and leave. I was standing about 2 feet away from the open basement door when it happened. From the darkness below, we heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps walking on the concrete floor. Both of us froze. The footsteps were so loud and clear that there was no denying what we were hearing. It sounded like heavy boots stepping on the cold floor. But then, the sound got infinitely worse. The slow footsteps suddenly broke into a full-on run. Someone was sprinting up the wooden basement stairs, fast and loud, coming directly toward the open door where we were standing. The heavy thuds on the wooden steps got louder and faster. I looked at Jen, and all the color had completely drained from her face. She was pale as a ghost. Running on pure instinct, I grabbed the handle of the basement door and slammed it shut with all my strength. We didn't say a word. We just spun around, sprinted out of the front door, and ran across the front lawn. As we were running, Jen yelled behind me about the key to the unit. I yelled back at her to just leave it. We didn't stop running until we reached the completely opposite side of the condo complex. I barely remember the details of what happened immediately after that. Eventually, we walked over to the property manager's office and told her that we thought someone was inside the unit. We left our cleaning supplies behind and refused to go back. As far as I know, the property manager called the police to check the unit before anyone else went inside. Jen and I never told her what we actually experienced that afternoon. I mean, what could we possibly say? That an invisible entity had spent the entire afternoon whispering our names, sliding a jammed drawer, turning on light switches, and finally charging up the basement stairs at us. It would have sounded completely ridiculous. Even today, I am not someone who easily believes in the paranormal. I try to find a logical explanation for everything. Maybe we both imagined hearing our names because we were already nervous. Maybe there was a weird mechanical issue with the oven drawer. Maybe the light switch had a short circuit. But that basement was completely empty. There was absolutely nowhere for a human being to hide down there, and those running footsteps on the stairs were not faint or distant. They sounded exactly like a heavy person sprinting up the wooden steps directly toward us. Even now, more than 20 years later, whenever I hear someone running up a set of stairs, I am instantly transported back to that hot summer afternoon. I remain a skeptic, but I have never been able to find a logical explanation for what happened in that condo. A few years later, when I was a bit older, I was still a hustler and a go-getter, always looking for the next way to make a quick buck. My mom knew an elderly couple from her church group who were looking for some help around their property for a couple of weeks. Their names were Richard and Elaine, and they were both in their late 60s. They were older, but they weren't frail or helpless by any means. They lived in a very rural area about 40 minutes away from my house. Their home was an old, classic farmhouse that sat at the end of a long, winding gravel driveway, with dense, dark woods wrapping around the back of the property. The arrangement we made was simple. I would stay at their house for a little over a week, help Richard with physical chores like yard work, cleaning out their cluttered garage, moving heavy furniture, and painting a long wooden fence. In exchange, they would pay me a lump sum at the end of the week. My mom fully trusted them because she had known Richard for many years through the church. And Elaine seemed incredibly sweet when I first met her. She was a quiet woman, but she smiled constantly and kept asking me if I was hungry or if I needed anything to drink. The farmhouse itself was nice, exactly what you would expect an elderly couple to live in. Up on the second floor, at the very end of the hallway, was the guest bedroom where I would be sleeping. On my first day there, Richard took me around the property to show me what we would be working on. He gave me a list of tasks, and Elaine made us a wonderful dinner. I noticed early on that Elaine didn't talk very much, but she kept a neutral, almost frozen smile on her face. During dinner, she asked me what my name was 3 different times. Richard noticed my confusion and quickly chimed in, saying that she just forgot things sometimes. I assumed he meant normal, age-related forgetfulness, so I didn't think much of it and went on with my evening. That night, I went up to the guest room around 11 o'clock and tried to get some sleep. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It was the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Someone was walking back and forth, right outside my bedroom door. I could hear the old floorboards creaking under their weight every few seconds. At first, I thought maybe Richard was just going to the bathroom, but the footsteps didn't go toward the bathroom. They just paced back and forth. They would pass my door, walk to the end of the hallway, turn around, and walk back. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to this pacing for about 10 minutes. It started to feel incredibly uncomfortable. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. I stared at the wide gap at the bottom of the door, where the light from the hallway was shining through. In the gap, I could clearly see the dark outline of 2 feet standing right there. After a while, the shadow moved, and the footsteps slowly faded away down the hall. The next morning, while Richard and I were outside working on the fence, I decided to mention it to him. He didn't look surprised at all. He just sighed and told me that Elaine sometimes wandered around the house at night because she had bad dreams and got confused. He told me I shouldn't worry about it. I asked him if I should lock my bedroom door at night, but he laughed and said the guest room door didn't have a lock because the house was so old. I tried to let it go, but the second night was much worse. I woke up again to the exact same sound of footsteps, but this time they were much faster, almost frantic. I could also hear Elaine whispering and muttering to herself in the hallway. I couldn't make out most of what she was saying, but then I distinctly heard her mutter my name. It gave me instant goosebumps. Her shadow passed under my door 3 or 4 times. I was really starting to hate the large gap under that door. Suddenly I heard the doorknob jiggle. It twisted slowly, stopped, and the door creaked open about an inch. It stayed cracked open for a long moment, and I could hear a faint raspy whispering voice coming through the gap. I strained my ears, but I couldn't understand the words. Then the door slowly slid shut again. I had a terrible time trying to fall back asleep after that. The next morning, I told Richard exactly what had happened. Once again, he brushed it off. He told me that she probably just forgot I was in there, thought the room was empty, and was looking around. He said she had been doing things like that more often lately. He also mentioned that she would be highly embarrassed if she knew I was talking about it, and he asked me not to bring it up in front of her. During the day, Elaine seemed completely normal. She made us lunch, folded laundry, and watered her garden plants. It made the whole situation very hard to process because she seemed like a sweet grandmother. But every now and then, I would catch her staring at me from across the room. Her smile would be completely gone, replaced by a flat, cold, highly suspicious glare. It was like she didn't recognize who I was and was deeply angry that I was standing in her house. On the 4th day, Richard and I were cleaning out a metal storage shed behind the house. As I was moving some heavy boxes, I noticed a dented metal walker shoved into a dark corner. One of its legs was bent at a 45-degree angle. Next to it was a shattered picture frame with dark, dried brown stains splattered across the glass. It looked like dried blood, which felt very out of place. Later that afternoon, when I went inside to use the restroom, I noticed a long, deep scratch on the hallway wall at about chest height, as if something heavy and sharp had been violently dragged across it. I also noticed several small, jagged holes in one of the downstairs doors, looking like someone had repeatedly slammed a heavy object into the wood. These felt like unmistakable signs of some kind of physical struggle. That night, I decided I wasn't taking any chances. I placed my heavy suitcase directly in front of my bedroom door. It wasn't heavy enough to block someone completely, but I knew it would make a loud scraping sound if anyone tried to push the door open. Around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up to the distinct sound of plastic scraping against the wooden floorboards. I sat up in bed and saw that my bedroom door was halfway open. Elaine was standing right there in the doorway, wearing a long white nightgown. Her mouth was hanging wide open, and she was breathing heavily through her mouth. I tried to keep my voice steady as I said her name, but I was terrified. She slowly stepped into the room. That was when I noticed she was holding a large kitchen knife down by her side. She walked closer to my bed and started whispering under her breath. As she got closer, I could finally understand what she was saying. She was repeating, "You don't belong here," over and over again. She stood right at the side of my bed, hovering over me, with the knife gripped tightly in her hand. I screamed for Richard as loud as I possibly could. Elaine flinched, looking startled by the sudden noise. She turned around and marched out of the room in a very stiff, robotic way that was incredibly unnerving. She slammed the door behind her. Richard came running upstairs about 30 seconds later, looking annoyed, as if I had woken him up over nothing. I yelled at him, telling him that Elaine had just been standing over my bed with a massive kitchen knife. He just shook his head and kept insisting that she would never hurt anyone, and that she just wasn't herself at night. At this point, his constant downplaying of her dangerous behavior was starting to make me angry. I told him I wanted to leave immediately. He looked at the clock, sighed, and said it was 3 in the morning, and my mom was probably fast asleep. He told me we would talk about it in the morning, and that I should just go back to sleep. I should have called my mom right then and there, but I didn't want to cause a massive scene in the middle of the night. Once Richard left, I pushed the heavy wooden dresser in front of the door and stayed awake, staring at the entrance until the sun finally came up. The next morning, Elaine was acting like nothing had happened. She made a big plate of pancakes and was smiling warmly, giving off total grandmother vibes. Richard pulled me aside to apologize, but his apology felt incredibly empty. He admitted that Elaine's memory had been getting significantly worse lately, which felt like a massive understatement. I asked him flat out if she had ever attacked anyone before. He hesitated for a long moment before admitting that she had gotten upset with a caregiver once in the past, but he claimed the situation had been handled. That was the moment I realized he had been actively hiding the truth from me. I told him again that I was leaving. He said he understood, but claimed my mom was at work until late that evening. He promised he would drive me home himself the following morning, right after we finished one last small chore and they paid me my money. That afternoon, while Richard was outside making a phone call, I went to look for my backpack because I wanted to pack my things early. For some reason, I found it sitting in the laundry room on top of the washing machine. When I picked it up, I froze. There was a fresh, dark red blood stain smeared across the outer pocket of the bag. I immediately ran outside, called Richard into the laundry room, and demanded to know what happened. He looked at the backpack, and for the first time, he looked angry. He snapped at me, claiming he had accidentally cut his hand earlier and must have gotten blood on my bag when he moved it out of the way. He finished by telling me to stop worrying so much. I told him I was calling my mom right now. He tried to calm me down, but I ignored him, went upstairs, packed my things, and dialed my mom's number. The call failed twice. I tried sending her a text message, but it wouldn't go through. I asked Richard for the Wi-Fi password, but he refused to give it to me. That was when a wave of pure dread hit me. I realized I was trapped in this isolated farmhouse. I had no choice but to try and survive one more night until my mom came to get me the next morning. On that final night, I didn't even get under the covers. I sat on top of the bed, fully dressed, wearing my shoes, with my backpack sitting right next to me. I pushed the heavy dresser in front of the door again, but around midnight I heard a knock. It was Richard. He told me to move the dresser away from the door because it was a dangerous fire hazard. I refused at first, but then, for the first time, Richard raised his voice and yelled at me, commanding me to move it. I complied, sliding it just enough so the door could open, not wanting to make him angrier. After he went back downstairs, I sat in the dark, clutching my phone. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a sudden scream from downstairs. It was Elaine, and she was screaming at Richard. Then the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. I heard Richard shouting her name, trying to calm her down. followed by a loud, heavy thud and a scream of pain from Richard. It sounded like she had just violently attacked him with a heavy object. I jumped up and cracked my bedroom door open. The hallway was pitch black, but I could see light spilling from the stairs. Suddenly, I heard heavy, rapid footsteps starting to run up the stairs. I slammed my door shut, threw my weight against the dresser, and shoved it back in front of the door. A second later, Elaine slammed into the door from the other side. The doorknob rattled violently. She started screaming, "You don't belong here!" over and over again. Her voice sounded completely furious, full of rage. She threw her body against the door again and again. Suddenly, I heard a loud metallic strike against the wood, and a large piece of the door splintered inward. I realized she had a weapon. I looked over at the window, knowing it was my only way out. I could hear Richard downstairs, groaning in pain and weakly calling out her name. Whatever she had done to him, she was going to do to me. I unlocked the window, pushed it up, and kicked out the screen. There was a small slanted roof over the front porch directly below my window. I grabbed my backpack, scrambled out onto the roof, and dropped down into the bushes below. As I hit the ground, I could still hear Elaine violently hacking away at my bedroom door. I ran down the long gravel driveway as fast as I could. I heard the front door slam open behind me. I looked back and saw Elaine standing on the porch in her nightgown, holding a heavy metal fireplace poker, screaming into the night. I kept running until I reached the main road, where my phone finally got enough service to call 911. The police and an ambulance arrived about 15 minutes later. Richard was treated for a deep cut on his head and a broken wrist from trying to disarm her. Elaine was taken away in an ambulance. The police contacted my mom, who rushed over as fast as she could. Richard later admitted to my mom that Elaine's condition had been deteriorating for months, but he refused to put her in a care facility because he felt too guilty. He thought he could handle her violent outbursts on his own, even though she had already physically attacked 2 professional caregivers before I ever arrived. My mom was so angry that if Richard hadn't been an injured elderly man, she probably would have slapped him right then and there. When I look back on all of these events now, many years later, I realize how fragile our sense of safety really is. Whether it was the strange house at the end of the dead-end street, with the unannounced resident, the locked rooms, and the text message that proved someone was watching my every move, or the abandoned condo where footsteps chased us up from an empty concrete basement, or even the rural farmhouse where a husband's denial almost cost both of us our lives. In every single one of these situations, there were clear, undeniable warning signs. There were moments when my gut was screaming at me to pay attention to the dust on the magnets, the open attic hatches, the blood on my backpack, or the dented walker in the shed. But as human beings, we have this powerful, almost dangerous instinct to rationalize the abnormal. We want so badly to believe that the world is a safe, logical place, and that the people around us are harmless. We tell ourselves that a man wandering at night is just a confused relative, that a moving drawer is just a broken rail, and that an elderly woman is just having a bad dream. We do this because the alternative is to admit that we are in immediate, physical danger, and that is a terrifying realization to make. We hold on to hope that things are still normal for as long as possible, and we often ignore our own survival instincts until the threat is standing right over our bed with a knife, or charging up the stairs directly toward us. I was incredibly lucky to escape from all of those situations without any physical harm, but the mental scars remain. I still find myself checking the locks on my doors multiple times before I can go to sleep at night. I still feel a spike of adrenaline whenever I hear the unexpected sound of heavy, running footsteps on a staircase, and I am still extremely careful about the jobs I accept and the places I choose to stay. Those experiences taught me that our intuition is often the only thing standing between us and a terrible tragedy. If something feels wrong, it is because something is wrong. It is always better to leave a situation and risk looking dramatic or paranoid than to stay and find out what would have happened if you had ignored your gut. It is a lesson that I had to learn the hard way, but it is one that has kept me safe ever much since. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.